Hi, this is Isaac Carr with CCSK Law, here to give you an update about what's going on with the PPP loans. All right, well, before, the SBA had said on April 3rd, today, that the small businesses and sole proprietors would be able to start submitting applications to banks that would then be processed through the SBA. They said for independent contractors and qualified self-employed individuals, that would begin on April 10th. Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, said this morning before 9 a.m. that community banks had processed over 700 loans for $2.5 million. And then another update came out approximately an hour ago that said 400 million had been handed out. However, there are banks like Chase that had said last night that they weren't sure how everything was going to be processed today. Specifically that they hadn't been given enough guidance. Yesterday evening, the SBA released a Interim Final Rule that gave guidance to these banks on how to move forward with this, as well as some last-minute clarifications. I'm going to go through some of those highlights with you today so that you have an update about some of the changes that have been made last minute here that will affect how the loan works and how the forgiveness works. And it might change some of your thought process about this. Fundamentally, it still serves the same purpose to try to keep people off of unemployment. Remember that in all cases, that's the main goal of the federal government with this program. And so for it to best assist you, that's going to be the driving force behind it. Let's go into some of these aspects of the SBA Interim Final Rule that was released last night to give guidance to individuals or to the small businesses submitting as well as the lenders on how to actually hand out these funds. All right, first off, let's talk a little bit about the loan. The first one that I want to talk about is the interest rate. Previously, the interest rate had been at a 0.5%, a 0.5%, which was a crazy low interest rate that no one really had ever seen. They have now increased that to a 1%. Now, the text of the law had provided up to 4%, but the Treasury Secretary has now locked it in at a 1%, and they gave a three-part reasoning for why they have now increased it from the 0.5% to the 1%. First, they said it provides a low-cost funds to borrowers to meet eligible payroll costs and other expenses. Well, so did the 0.5%. Second, for lenders, the 100 basis points offers an attractive interest rate relative to the cost of funding comparable to the maturity. So they said this will be more attractive for banks. Realistic reasoning in that manner. Third, the interest rate is a higher yield on the Treasury securities for comparable. Again, basically they needed more money for it to work. The 0.5% was not enough to attract banks, and it wasn't enough for the Treasury, even though they are the ones who put that out. So they needed to increase that to that 1%, which is still much better than the 4%, and even 4% isn't that bad. But a 1% is still a good rate there for small businesses. This shouldn't change whether or not you go after this just because they increased it from a 0.5% to a 1%. All right. The other thing that is locked in that they had said a few days before, but they reiterated in this interim rule, is the 2-year loan. Now, the text of the law provides that the loan can be up to 10 years, but in this instance, they have dropped it down to a 2-year. And they said that while the Act provides that a loan will have the maximum maturity up to the 10 years, and this is the key language that I've been looking for. The administrator, in consultation with the secretary. Whenever it's said in this interim rule, the administrator in consultation with the secretary, it means that they were changing something. They say it 11 times in this interim rule, and I'm going to talk about pretty much all of them. They have determined that the 2-year loan is sufficient in light of the temporary economic dislocations caused by, basically 10 years, they believe 10 years was too long. They want the money back within 2 years. Next up, the administrator determined in consultation with the secretary that 6-month deferment period is appropriate in light of the modest interest rate, the 1% on PPP loans. This is them saying that there's a 6-month deferment. They had said this earlier, but now they're really locking it in with the final rule. And so that will be 6 months before you have to start paying back this loan. Interest will accrue during that time, but you need to budget for that. If any part of that is not forgiven, and we will be going into some of the aspects of the loan forgiveness. They did specify that the administrator, in consultation with the secretary, has determined that no eligible borrower may receive more than one PPP loan. If that was ever a question for you of whether you should apply for one or more, you can only do the one. However, it has been clarified that you can apply for both the SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loan, which is separate. That's the application that you submit through the online SBA portal. You can apply for that one as well as the PPP. However, you cannot apply for the same funds. Do not go to the SBA for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan and apply for payroll or for payment of your employees if you are going to use the PPP loan program. All right? You must choose one or the other when you're talking about those same funds. Further, the amount forgiven under the PPP will be reduced by that amount that you got underneath the SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loan. So one of the key elements of the Economic Injury Disaster Loan is the $10,000 grant that is provided if you first apply. That will be deducted from the amount forgiven under the loan. Finally, if you use the PPP funds for unauthorized purposes, basically for non-qualified expenses, if you have any question about what qualified expenses are, check out my previous blogs and my previous videos where I talk about that. I'll put all these links over in the comments. The SBA, if you use the PPP funds for unauthorized purposes, the SBA will direct you to repay those amounts, and if you knowingly use those funds for unauthorized, you'll be subject to additional liability, such as charges for fraud. Basically, don't lie to the government. All right. Next up, underneath this interim final rule, we're going to talk about who can apply. This right here, the next comment is going to be a big change that changed things for us as well. Do independent contractors count as employees for the purposes of the PPP loan calculations? No. Independent contractors have the ability to apply for the PPP loans on their own, so they do not count for purposes of a borrower's PPP loan calculation. This is an important clarification. Previously at hand, a lot of businesses had been including their independent contractors in their loan calculation because even their 1099s were run through their payroll system. In this interim rule, they have clarified that no, the independent contractors will have to apply on their own. And as I had stated earlier, independent contractors will begin to be processed on April 10th rather than today, April 3rd. If you have already submitted your application, you need to redo your application and then get it resubmitted and have your independent contractors apply on their own using their 1099 documentation. Next, they clarified that the administrator, in consultation with the secretary, said that household employees do not count. This means if you have a household employee defined under the IRS as someone who is doing work in or around your house that you have now hired as an employee. This is some examples of this are babysitters, butlers, caretakers, cooks, domestic workers, drivers, health aides, house cleaning workers, housekeepers, maids, nannies, private nurses, and yard workers if you are employing them for your private home. This is not to say that somebody who runs a babysitting business cannot apply. This is saying that if the employer is the private household, that does not count underneath the PPP loans. All right, next up, let's talk about forgiveness and some of the updates that the SBA interim final rule had talked about for forgiveness. This is another big one. No more than 25% of the money may be spent on things other than payroll, otherwise it won't be forgiven. Previously, it said that you have to pay your employees 75% of what they were getting paid. However, they've kind of flipped that on its head. The administrator, in consultation with the secretary, another one of these where they have kind of clearly defining that this is a change, has determined that 75% is an appropriate percentage that will align with the element of the program with the loan amount. 75%, which is equivalent to the 8 weeks of payroll. The limitation on the use of funds will help ensure that the finite appropriations available for these loans are directed towards payroll protection, as each loan is issued depletes the appropriation regardless of whether those proportions of the loan are later forgiven. Basically, they're saying 75% needs to be spent on payroll. Again, I said at the beginning of this that you want to always remember the driving force behind this was for the federal government wanted to keep unemployment rates low as low as possible. That is their main driving force, which in this case, they're saying now you have to spend that 75% on your payroll. The next part of is transitioning into an explanation for lenders. Specifically, it says that lenders can rely on the borrower's documentation for loan forgiveness. The lender does not need to conduct any verification if the borrower submits documentation supporting its request for loan forgiveness. So that's an aspect that from the loan forgiveness that we are now moving into lenders and agents. So here's some clarification for lenders and agents. First off, what fees will lenders be paid? This is what some of the information that the banks have been holding off on. The banks are not sure about how to move forward with this. The SBA is hoping that this interim final rule will provide that guidance so that banks can start moving forward. Though, as I had said earlier, Steve Mnuchin has stated in his Twitter feed that over $400 million has already been given out, and that was as of about an hour ago. So, next is that what fees will the lenders be paid? SBA will pay lenders for processing PPP loans in the following amounts: 5% of loans not more than $350,000, 3% for loans more than $350,000 and less than $2 million, and 1% for loans at least $2 million. Now, do lenders have to apply for the credit elsewhere test? No. In evaluating the applicant's eligibility, they don't need to basically see whether or not you could apply for this credit elsewhere. A previous aspect of a lot of SBA loans is whether or not you could just get this money somewhere else. In this fashion, they're saying, no, the banks don't need to test for that. Who pays the fee to an agent who assists a borrower? Now, in this instance, I've been advising people for the most part to go directly through your administrator, your bank, to be able to figure out how to best apply for these funds, because the application is relatively straightforward in the documentation that you attach. However, I want to say that there's going to be some people out there who are offering their services to help you fill this out. If you truly need assistance help filling this out, then at that point, then you could reach out to someone, you could reach out to us, and we can facilitate this the best that we can. Because I've studied this text of this law and kept up with this, I'll tell you, many times. It's been a very long week. But I've answered a lot of questions, trying to keep up with people on these updates, and that's why I'm jumping on here again today, because there are agents who can help you. For the most part, I think most of you can do it by yourself. Most of you can submit the documentation, follow the rules that your administrator or your bank is telling you, but I know it's been tough to get a hold of banks. So if you really need some guidance, you can pay an agent to start helping submit these. Like I said, for the most part, I don't think most of businesses will need it, but if you truly need that clarification, feel free to reach out to us. And if you feel like hiring us, then at that point, then we can have that discussion. And here are some of the rules that the SBA has said with regard to agents. First off, agents' fees will be paid by the lender out of the fees the lender receives from the SBA. Agents may not collect fees from the borrower or be paid out of the PPP loan proceeds. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm going to get paid a percentage of your loan proceeds, or if they say that they're going to collect the fee from the borrower, the small business directly, that's not okay. The SBA has specifically said that is not the way that this is going to be run. Rather, that it comes from the lender to pay for this assistance that has been given. The total amount that an agent may collect from the lender for assistance in preparation for applying for the PPP loan, including referral to the lender, may not exceed 1% for loans more than $350,000, 0.5% for loans more than $350,000 and less than $2 million, and 0.25%, 0.25% for loans of at least $2 million. The Act authorizes the administrator to establish limits on agents' fees. The administrator, in consultation with the secretary, there's the magic words, determined that the agent fees limits set forth above are reasonable based upon the application requirements and that the fees the lender receives for making the PPP loans. Now that they have told the lenders about how much they are going to be getting paid on this, now they've said for the agents who help, you get paid through the lenders at a reduced percentage rate, so the lender still makes money and the agent can make a little bit of that as well, though the Act authorizes the administrator to establish limits on agent fees. Finally, can PPP loans be sold into secondary markets? Basically, rather than going through a bank and then buying it directly to the SBA, can it be sold on a secondary market? Yes, a PPP loan may be sold on the secondary market after the loan is fully dispersed. A PPP loan may be sold on the secondary market at a premium or a discount to par value. So whatever it wants. The SBA will issue guidance regarding any advance purchase for loans sold in secondary market. So we can expect that there will be more updates coming soon. But those were the main points that we needed to hit on today for the SBA interim final rule that was released last night or last evening, yesterday evening, to discuss about how banks were going to make this happen. Again, it sounds like there are some banks that Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has said is already processing this today. I haven't heard of them yet, and like I said, a lot of banks were confused about how to move forward with this. The SBA are saying that this guidance should be enough to get them over that hill, and we will start seeing if things get processed today. I'm Isaac Carr with CCSK Law, where we're giving you the most recent updates as they come available to us to give you the guidance. If you have questions, feel free to post in the comments. Send us an email at isaac@ccsklaw.com. That's ISAAC@ccsklaw.com to ask any questions that you might have. And again, we're going to try to stay up to date with everyone with all the most recent information so that we can be with you through this storm. We will talk to you again soon with further updates.